Natalia Heckman, thank you so much for joining us on Highest Aspirations.
It's my pleasure to be here. I love your podcast. I'm so excited about the topic that we're discussing today.
Thanks so much. And you're just another member of the Sidelets family joining us to come on. We've had so many of you, and it's great to have this partnership and to kind of bounce ideas off each other. I won't say who it was, but just before this call, I was actually speaking with another person for another topic from Sidelets. So you're doing great work over there.
Thank you.
So I want to start by level setting on a couple of terms that we're going to talk a lot about during this conversation that are in the title here. How would you define passive or receptive vocabulary versus active or productive vocabulary? Could you give us like a quick working definition and perhaps an example of each to kind of set the table for the rest of the conversation?
Okay, so I'll explain where the terms come from, and I'll give you one personal example. It's a really simple concept, actually. As humans, it works for all people, not just language learners. We know more words that we can use. So every person has a passive or receptive lexicon, that internal word bank, and active or productive vocabulary, the words that we use. So the receptive vocabulary consists of words we recognize, we understand when we read a text or when we hear when we hear the words in speech. And the productive lexicon, these are actually the words that we can use spontaneously, more or less, in our own speaking and writing. This directly corresponds to language usage domains. And we always think about four. So listening and reading and speaking and writing. So these are, in the way that we use vocabulary according to those language domains. Our receptive vocabularies are much larger than our active vocabularies, and it's normal. It's to be expected. And I mentioned earlier, we understand more words that we actually know how to use. So my personal example, and actually I had to think about that. I'm going to use the word incendiary. So if you look it up, the incendiary is something that is designed to cause fires. And I knew what the word meant when I heard it on TV. I knew what it meant when I maybe saw it in print sometime, but I never used it until this moment right now. So that's my first time actually saying out loud in our conversation here. This word, if I did not use it today, it would continue living in my receptive lexicon only, and it may never transfer to my active vocabulary. So unless I make an effort or unless I have a situation that allows for that transfer, it may never happen.
Yeah,
that explains.
Oh, it definitely does. And I think like most people know what those terms mean, but I think I wanted to ask that question, even though it may have seemed a little elementary, because, well, basically because of the answer that you gave us, you just gave us a really good working definition of it. And I think the use of the word incendiary, which may or may not be a word that I've actually ever used on my own either, it might have been a part of my passive vocabulary, gives us a great example. And I think you've also illustrated the point that we're going to get into today is you actually have to sort of make an attempt to use a word to bring it into your active vocabulary, which is not easy. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, I don't know, as the older I get or what it is that I feel like I'm grasping, right, for these words that I've read about that I thought was such a great word to use, but I can't come up with it. This is as a native English speaker. So that kind of gets us to the next question I have for you, which is like that transfer, right? The transfer from passive to active vocabulary, as you just very nicely illustrated, does not happen on its own. You used incendiary. Hopefully you'll continue to use it a few more times, and then you'll wow people with that vocabulary word in lots of different places. For a teacher, it's a different situation almost, right? The motivation's different. How does a teacher go about making that transfer happen as quickly and as effectively as possible, but without overwhelming students, getting to the point of productive struggle, but not too much struggle where they don't want to do it?
Okay, so from the perspective of an English learner, what is often overwhelming is actually sitting and listening for vast stretches of time to that
Great
continuous and in an uninterrupted flow of speech, and especially in the foreign language. So, and I always ask whenever where I'm in training, or maybe there's a person who never learned a foreign language, I say, okay, turn on a foreign film with no subtitles and see how long it's going to, how quickly you'll get exhausted just from listening. That's why our English learners or multilinguals are so tired by the end of the day. Their brains are melting. It does take a lot of effort to listen, and that's what overwhelming. So number one, teachers can do is to allow time in our lesson plans for those conversations. And you probably know that we tend to overplan. When we run out of time, students' talk is the first thing that gets cut. So we sacrifice those priceless moments when the actual learning takes place. So when that language gets internalized for the sake of covering the curriculum, because there's so many things we have to get done. Mm-hmm. So it might be actually for us advantageous to turn our attention to the amount of time we purposefully allocate to student talk. And it has to start with planning.
Another great point. I was thinking one of the probably most interesting professional development opportunities I've had was a really simple one. And it was just shadowing a student for a day. That was it. I shadowed a student for a day and I kind of reflected on the experience, got myself into what a student was doing. And I was teaching high school and I was utterly exhausted, just as I was when I was a student, because in most situations, the teachers were speaking the entire time. So I really appreciate you bringing that up as really one of the biggest pain points and what really exhausts students, particularly multilingual learners. And yeah, the other piece that people can certainly reflect on and think about a lot is what gets cut when you're trying to get through everything and how do you get those moments in. So much appreciated there. I've read a few of your blog posts, kind of how we started this conversation, although, as I mentioned, I love the work that everybody's doing at Silence. But in one of those blog posts, you referenced Marzanos' 6-step process for building academic vocabulary. And you specifically talked about the fact that students need to negotiate the meaning of words through application. They essentially need to test them out and see if they can make sense of them to others. If that's the case, how can teachers go about creating those kind of safe spaces where students at varying levels can kind of test the waters freely? Because that's an issue, right? Like what's the classroom environment like? So how do you set up an environment where not only are you not talking all the time, but you're creating a safe space for students to be able to take risks?
It's a two-part question there. I'm going to take one piece at a time. So
I'm famous for those two-part questions. Sorry.
Okay, but I'm going to keep in mind for the second part. We'll get to Marzanos steps, but you're absolutely right. The only way to learn a language is through communication. And that communication will not happen without the culture of respect and collaboration in the classroom. So when we invest time into teaching kids how to work in pairs, work in groups, how to praise one another, how to take turns, we're actually investing time into the right thing. And it does take time. Procedural side of setting up the language environment takes time. So, but it's worth it because that's how we create that risk-free place where languages flourish, where language learning takes place, because students need to be comfortable participating in those conversations with peers. And we know how awkward sometimes it is to even for adults to get a conversation started. Now, in Texas, and I can't speak for the rest of the country, but I'm pretty sure that Spencer Kagan is a well-known name. And I don't think we have a single campus here in Texas that has not received training on Kagan's collaborative routines. If I mentioned just a couple, you probably know exactly what those are. So numbered heads together, stand up, pair up, tip trade. And many of those, we just do those intuitively. After teaching for a while, you know how to get kids moving and form those partnerships. But those are all Kagan's structures, and that's a great place to start investing into that process of collaboration in every classroom. And if you want Marzano to work, I would say do Kagan first. So in going to Marzano, I was actually being silly in that blog. I said that there's a reason there are 6 steps in Marzano's vocabulary process. And you mentioned in the beginning that it takes more than once. Just hearing the word once does not transfer it from our passive receptive lexicon to the place where we can use it comfortably. So if I, when I look at Marzanos process, it's really very helpful for me to have that framework. And all the steps start with the letter D. That's how I remember them. So describe, draw, do, discuss, and play. Play is the only one that's the oddball there at the end, but that's the fun one, right? Plan. So when I look at my, oh my goodness, my phone rang.
It happens. Real
No,
life.
the only thing, I forgot to turn off my phone. How is that even possible? I did everything else. I
It's
followed
okay.
directions. So if I look at the Marzanos vocabulary 6 steps, it starts from the place where it's the teacher tells what the word means in basic, simple words. Then let's ask the student, tell me what do you think that word means? So the student describes, or the student tells the, in a way, shows a definition, understanding of the definition. And then the kids have a chance to draw anything. Sketchnoting is so popular. So it's such a great way to process that listening that we may be doing just through sketching something. And it's not about my artistic talents as a teacher. I don't have to be an artist. It's up to the students what they draw to create that memory cue. And then we go to that do part. So do something with the word. It doesn't even have to be conversational yet. It could be sorting. It could be breaking the word apart. So looking at some word parts, some morphology. It could be matching. It could be matching synonyms or finding antonyms. Now, when we get to discuss, look how many steps we already got through. And discussion part, that's where the students actually use the word in a conversation, but it may be not unprompted. It may be not spontaneous conversation yet. It could be rehearsed. And then eventually last part 6 is at play. So charades, word associations. Notice that it's gradual. So it starts from very carefully, let's look at the meaning of the word, and it moves it to the active vocabulary. It moves it to the place where I'm comfortable enough to use it without somebody prompting me to do that. So that's the Marzano. That's why I love Marzano's 6 steps there.
Yeah. And I think, we have, or certainly I'll speak for myself as a former foreign language teacher. I mean, I had the tendency when I started to want to go from kind of 0 to everywhere, like not follow those steps. And I think, I did that because I just didn't really have a great understanding of what we're talking about right now, how you incorporate those words from your passive vocabulary into your active vocabulary, but also because I saw how quickly, excuse me, many students, and this is particularly true for multilingual learners that we work with, they can generally pick up their social language pretty quickly, right? The informal language, because it's built on relationships and it's trust and it's just a different situation. But the academic language or the academic vocabulary typically falls behind, it lags behind, which of course can then mean that some students never get to the academic level that they want, or you have the issue with long-term English learners, or the problems go on and on. So what I'm going to ask you right now is kind of what I think I lacked as a new teacher, even not a teacher of multilingual learners, but a teacher of students who are learning Spanish for the first time. What are some simple ways that teachers can help students practice their academic language, especially when they're so much more, particularly high school students who I worked with, but I think all students, they're so much more motivated by the rewards of social language. So how do you pick those apart and really get them motivated to use that academic language?
I think that what you just said is just so true. Why do we acquire social language quickly and rather effortlessly? Because of massive exposure. It's everywhere. It's on social media. It's in the class. It's in the cafeteria. It's in the playground. We talk at home, or we speak to somebody, friends, peers, family, maybe. Now, unless it's a foreign language and you're learning in a country where you don't have that part. But for the most part, as our multilinguals learn English, they do have the massive exposure to the social language. At the same time, they have the expectation of that negotiated output. They have to participate. They have to have that interaction with the language where they are expected to respond orally in this case. In the academic register, it's almost the opposite. Much less exposure and very little expected production. So if I go into a classroom and I know that there is let's say it's a lecture, there's very little expectation of production of that. Whatever the vocabulary I hear, I will have to use it orally or in writing. Typically, we focus on comprehension, which is a great place to start, but it's just very often it ends at comprehension, never gets to that output part. And understanding something does not mean that you will be able to talk about it in using the vocabulary that is expected of you. Now, what are some things I can do? And I can just go through one domain at a time. So let's say I'm a teacher and we're in that lecture mode. I am delivering instruction. I want to stay in the academic register, and I want to pronounce words clearly. I want to focus on a couple of, not 10. So the list of 10 would be something, oh, there's so many words my kids need to know. What are those between 2 and 4 key terms that I'm going to draw students' attention to, create multiple exposure opportunities throughout the lesson? It's repetition. So I will just have to repeat those over and over and over again. If I'm lecturing and if I have slides on my screen, I want to point to the words that I pronounce. If I read a sentence from my slide, let's say, I want to track the print with my finger or with my laser pointer. So whatever is coming out of my mouth matches the print form of the word. So we enhance that connection between the sound and the print. And we know that many of our students need help with decoding. So right there, we just help a little bit along or help our students with literacy. Now, if I give opportunities for students to quarterly read something with me, that is so helpful. It takes a second, but it's a low risk strategy. How many sentences those are the most important ones that we're not going to read quarterly everything from every single slide. Of course not. But what is 1-2 sentences that I expect students to say once they get to that structured conversation portion? Those are the ones I'll read quarterly, because it can make a difference in students participating or not based on, are you comfortable saying that word? Do you know how to pronounce it? Especially in the secondary, that's intimidating, mispronouncing something. When I give my students the opportunity to partner read or read with a partner, the same paragraph maybe, or the same passage when it comes to content that I just delivered as a quick interactive lecture, it's different. It's helpful because now all that context that surrounds my oral speaking, so it surrounds my speaking. Let's say when my students are listening, they're also watching my body language. They have access to the visuals that I might be showing. I'm pointing to things. I'm maybe acting it out. I create that comprehensible input. Now it's the same content, but the students have to read it on their own. The nonverbal clues are removed. Can they use that vocabulary in reading, or can they figure out what the words mean when they negotiate the meaning just from the text, so just from reading? So this is just a quick follow-up there. After me as a teacher delivering, students listening, then what can we do next? And of course, the speaking portion of it, I would set the expectations for structured conversations in every classroom. So when I go into the lesson, even if it's a lecture style, I know that production is expected of me. And it just makes a difference in how I listen and how actively I will be listening to certain key moments that I would be expected to even repeat. That repetition. Turn to your partner and tell your partner exactly what the teacher just said. And even that is helpful. But for our conversations to be structured and not just turn and talk, and it's not free for all. We set that language target. So let's say this is the sentence that I want my students to use. And these are the vocabulary words that I would like for my students to use. Maybe those are the ones that's in my pocket chart. QSSA. You might have heard about this, and that's such a great hands-on, the best sharing conversations, structured conversation strategy, because it takes care of the procedural side. It's helpful. So if you Google it, it's everywhere, and it's QSSA. It's a sidelet strategy, my favorite. And the reward, you mentioned the reward of that social language, that we feel included when we feel part of the social group, when we can communicate effortlessly. So the interaction, the peer interaction with peers and feeling successful, it's the same really basic feeling you get from participating in the conversation with your peers. It's just the register of the language changes, but the reward, I think it's basically the same.
Yeah, this might be a really simple way of kind of distilling everything that you just said, but I think it's worth mentioning. We started out by talking about the academic language and how, or I'm sorry, not the academic language. We started talking about the social language and how it's everywhere, it's all around, and so you almost can't avoid it. Well, when you're working with that academic language and you really want students to be using it, you really have to kind of over prescribe it, right? Think of multiple different pathways to do it. And I think if you can think of it that way, if you're maybe a content teacher and maybe you haven't worked frequently with multilingual learners, this is something that can help. I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation how, I feel like the language that my passive vocabulary is getting is increasing and my active language vocabulary is decreasing because I'm not necessarily giving myself opportunities to use them. But as a teacher, if you're building in all of those different tools and strategies, you're kind of compensating for the things in social language which are all around. And I just think that looking at it that way might be a little bit easier to understand, because as a teacher myself, some of the things that I would do, some students get embarrassed by it. And if you notice that they're embarrassed by it, then it's hard for you, especially as, again, I keep referencing being a high school teacher. It can become difficult for a teacher to do those things because that's the last thing they want to do. But again, establishing an environment where that's okay, and then understanding it through that framework where you're kind of over prescribing, I think is really helpful.
Definitely. I think almost like that prescription, like over prescribing, when we say that term, we feel that some sort of negative connotation attached to it. But we do need that, as we need to see in what the sentence looks like. What do you want me to say? When we say you stay in the academic register, what exactly does that mean? It's really a combination of the vocabulary and the sentence types. So in order for our students to produce academic language, they need to see what it looks like. So the expectation has to be there, and that's the prescriptive nature of certain parts of the conversation. And we're not going to do it for every single interaction in the classroom, because that would be extremely boring and it's just not very welcoming. But for the key moments of the content, and language is a part of it, everything really about that. Content, internalizing the content, we cannot do it without having the proper language for it. So when we have this conversation with educators, very often I say, well, why do we need sentence stems? I can say it in many different ways. And I say, okay, well, you are a native English speaker. I'm an English learner. For me, in order for me to internalize this sentence or maybe that phrase, I don't need to hear it a billion different ways. I need to hear it one way, a billion different times.
Yeah, I like that.
So I'm going to say, okay, in order for me, if I want my students to truly internalize that language, they need to hear it more than once. And it will only happen if I set the standard and provide the structure for those conversations that will happen in my classroom.
All right, so let me zoom out a little bit, because we all know that there are teachers who are working under great leadership with great curricula, who are doing great things. Those are great combination. There's other teachers who maybe are experiencing a lot of shifting leadership, which is very common now, or curriculum is constantly changing. And so they're in their classrooms making great decisions every day about using academic vocabulary, for example. So that kind of brings me to my question here, which is like, how much of what we're sort of talking about here, how much is it related to curriculum development and design, as opposed to the individual sort of choices good teachers are making every day? And I guess what I'm getting at is, if the objective is for students to perform well in standardized tests or to get through a specific curriculum, how do you get teachers, or how do teachers go and justify building in more time, as you said, for discussion and practicing academic language? I know that's kind of it's a tricky question. Maybe it's a little unfair, but that's a big one. It's important for a lot of people.
Is and it does. It's constantly on our mind. It's constantly these are the conversations that happen in the teacher lounges, right? So I see the curriculum as a pathway, and it has to be in place because it sets the goal of that vertical alignment. So as a teacher, I need to know what are some certain things that my students absolutely have to know before they move to the next grade. So that's for the most part the purpose of the curriculum, but it's the map. And it's the teacher who steers that ship. If let's build that analogy there, ship of learning. You have the guide, you have the pathway, you know where you're going, but nobody can make decisions for you. It's the teacher who decides on what happens in the classroom. That's why we cannot micromanage teachers. We can share information. We can share the best practices and just make everybody just stop for a second and pause and think, hey, no matter how many things, it's really not about how many things there are in the curriculum. It's about how many things are being internalized by my students. And for me, embracing the need of student talk, it really caused such a pivotal shift in my thinking that I reconsidered many things that were going on in my classroom.
Yep.
So it became more, it's not about how much I cover, but it became more how much did you internalize, how much my kids internalized. Because if there were direct correlation between what we cover and how the kids test, everybody would be testing perfectly, because that's typically not the problem. We cover most of our curriculum or all of our curriculum. It's about that retention, retaining information, retaining vocabulary. So very often we hear or we say, well, I said something 100 times, right? Or I went over this 100 times, but it's not about how many times I said something. It's about how many opportunities I provided to my students to use the vocabulary or to use that word in speaking and writing. So that's where that shift happens of what is going on daily basis in the classroom really determines how much of that content that we strive to cover gets internalized by the students.
Yeah. One thing that you said at the very beginning of that answer that I think a lot of people are going to pick up on is we cannot micromanage teachers. I think that's really important. And you like the point here is, yes, you need a solid curriculum to know where you're going and know where you need to get. But if you're sort of micromanaging and making sure that you do every little thing, there is not going to be that retention that you talked about. And so there's that kind of classic structure versus agency. Give the structure, but allow teachers to be professionals and do what they need to do. I love that. One thing that we hear pretty frequently here, I hear it all the time, both from my colleagues at Elevation and guests that come on the podcast, is that good instruction for multilingual learners is good instruction for all students. And there are lots of different ways to kind of look at that and kind of prove that point. And I've said it a bunch of times that yes, that's something that I could work on as a native English speaker. So two kind of ways to ask this question. The first is how can focusing on transferring academic language from passive to active vocabulary banks help all students? And then like maybe the better, more kind of relevant question is, how do we differentiate for students at varying levels? If we have classrooms where we have students who are multilingual learners, students who are native English speakers, and we try to figure out where they are, how do we go about doing that?
That is a good question. And I think sometimes differentiation or the concept of differentiation does get misinterpreted quite often. So all students are academic language learners. And this is just so true for every single person, even English speakers. When they go into the classroom, the language is different from what they are exposed to, and we know that. Now, so when we say practicing academic language, it's not just, okay, let me pull all my multilinguals aside and let's sit in a circle and repeat after me. So that's not something that we want to happen. There has to be authentic interaction with the content, using the language of the content, and with other speakers, so other students in the classroom. That's why we're not by any means pulling the kids aside and offering different sets of activities, because we want everyone to be really receiving that rich content-based instruction. So the question is more about including English learners into the conversations, that have to happen in every classroom, regardless of whether or not you have multilingual learners there or not. So even if the class does not have any English learners, the structured conversations still have to happen. If I'm aware of the fact, or if I know I have English learners in my classroom, I become more aware that they need different scaffolding. So we're not creating a different lesson, or we're not building 3 different lessons, one for each level of the language, but we're offering different types of scaffolds for students who may be at different language proficiency levels. My beginner students may need more simplified sentence stems. They might need word banks, while my advanced students who are near proficient, they might need different types of supports. So really having that array of supports, and students are very intuitive. Eventually, and I've seen it in action, if there are several sentence stems, the kids will choose the one that is appropriate for them. So it's more of an offering as an option, as a choice, what's going to help you learn something. And then the kids reach out for that scaffold if we offer it to them, especially in the secondary setting. We're very often, I feel like we might be underestimating how much kids understand this is good for me. I can use this. I need a vocabulary. I need the dictionary for this. Or I need a sentence stem. I need a minute to talk to my first language or same language partner. I can't participate. And Carol Salva tells us all the time that language learning is not a deficiency. We just didn't have an opportunity maybe to learn a language, but we are not deficient in cognition. We can learn anything that you are offering us scaffolds to teach us. So.
Yeah, I love that idea of providing options and letting the students, to the extent that they're able, and in many times they are perfectly able, to choose the ones that work for them. That empowers them, and it doesn't make them feel undervalued, or that they need something that others don't have, which was kind of like where I was going to go with my next question. Well, I think we've addressed it. Again, as I've referenced this a bunch of times today as a high school teacher, it could be awkward, to sort of make that transition from social language to academic language in front of their peers. It was difficult. But you just mentioned one particular strategy. Well, it's not really a strategy, it's really just kind of a common practice, giving them options of sentence stems that they could use, letting them use the ones that they want that are best work for them. It's kind of letting go of the reins a little bit. Can you think of anything else that might work in a situation like that to kind of combat that awkwardness that puts that barrier up for students?
Yes. You're leaning towards confidence. We want students to feel confident in our classrooms, confident participating. But something that I'm really passionate about this, and I see it happening in so many classrooms, and I always praise teachers for putting so many scaffolds in place. And so confidence, it's not spontaneous or accidental. It doesn't just happen magically, right? It comes from all those linguistic and procedural supports that you as a teacher put in place. So if I see students participating in the conversation, just speaking in class, in one class they speak, in the other class we may say, well, they don't really say much. The question is why? And I think we can learn. You're a foreign language teacher. You can definitely relate to that. And we can learn so much from foreign language teachers in that aspect. So as a foreign language teacher, when you go into the lesson, you think in the back of your mind, you think, okay, my students do not know the language. And I have to, it prompts me and it forces me to assess those language tools that the kids will need. You're going to say, what are the words that I need to teach them? What are the sentence types that I need? What are the sentence stems need to be on my board? What will I read quarterly? What will I model? So all of these things, I think that in a foreign language classroom, always just we take it for granted, because that's what we're doing as foreign language
second
teachers.
nature. Yeah.
Second nature. So in any content area, if we just focus on that language a little bit more and amplify it, the same process may need to happen. And the term is like front loading those language tools and thinking ahead of time. If I want my students to speak, what supports will they need? Now I'll have to plan for those.
Yeah, we see that, talk about that a lot in particular content class, particularly math and STEM classes, where you really, really need to have that vocabulary front loaded in order to get the content down, not only just have conversations, but to understand the content. And we've talked a lot about speaking and listening. What about writing? I mean, how do you leverage, as we do a lot of writing, how do we leverage writing activities to support transferring passive vocabulary into active vocabulary? Is that something that works similarly? Is it different? Is it something that we can plan for?
I love the quote by Dr. Conti, and I'm reading his book. I just finished reading 2 of his books, but he says that you don't really know the word until you know how it behaves grammatically. And you just stop and pause there for a second, right? It makes you think. In writing, in my opinion, and it's just, it gives us time. It forces us to notice things in a language that otherwise we may not even notice. So in his book, and it's not in the blog post, but I'm just going to share it and see if it makes as much sense to others as it made to me as a language learner. So here's an interesting thing. When we listen to something, when we listen to a sentence, let's say, we do not process all words equally when we listen. We just skip over a lot of them. We focus on the words that carry meaning, and there's some other functional words we may not even notice, because we're focused on comprehension. In order for me to understand the gist of the message, I don't need to understand every single word in a sentence. So if you say, like, for example, you say, yesterday on account of rain, we stayed at home. I heard yesterday, rain, stay home. That's enough to figure out what was said, right?
Right.
I did not hear on account of. That's that academic register prepositions. I did not hear stayed. I did not hear ed at the end, because it's enough for me, because you said yesterday. My brain says, who cares about ed at the end? Yesterday is enough for me to figure out that it was past tense. So the way we process things while listening is enough to get the gist, that comprehension to happen. But in order for us to really use the language in speaking, and here we're talking about writing gives us time to say, oh my goodness, there's so many other things that I need to really slow down and notice in the language. So that's what happens in writing. It's when we give opportunity for students to write or record their thoughts, or record the content that they just acquired from you as a teacher, or from the text that they read, or from the lecture that they listen to. There's an extra layer of difficulty, but that's good. That's that productive struggle a little bit. Right. It forces us to focus on the language. So what are some things we can do? Simple dictations. And now not many people do it in the secondary. It's helpful. Let's write down the same paragraph that we just read. Helps us to make connection between, hey, this is what I hear, this is what I write. Fill in the blanks, close exercises. It's very helpful, because when I plug in certain words in a sentence, and it requires very little prep time. So it's the same paragraph that I used for reading, or the same paragraph that we read with my partner. Now let me mark out some words and have the students plug those back into the paragraph.
Yeah, just repurposing. Yep.
Repurposing, recycling the same things. We don't need to create anything new. And it's just, we also have that, we hit the mark for the multiple exposure, but that's a different type of interaction with the content. And of course, writing with paragraph frames, the same sentence stems that we just completed orally in my conversation with a partner, I can use as an exit ticket. And I say, okay, guys, there's sentence stems on the board. You can steal somebody else's answer that you heard during the discussion, or you can write your own, just one sentence, complete it in writing, drop it on the way out in the basket, or just submit it to me electronically. And I don't have to grade everything. So we always think that if it's writing, it has to be graded. Absolutely not. It's just another opportunity to have that interaction with the language and do it from the productive side of it. So where I'm the one producing sentences.
Yeah, you become more like an engineer almost when you're writing sentences. You're really thinking about it, and you're being more deliberate about how you're setting it up. And I love what you said as well about the repurposing, of course, that it's not something new and you got to create something brand new. And that, yes, like hallelujah, not everything has to be graded, right? It can be something that you're doing to give students another opportunity to learn, which I think is key. You know, we have that inclination often that if it's coming back to me, I must grade it and I must spend a tremendous amount of time on it. Not always the case. And that's freeing for a lot of people. So as we wrap up here, I want to get your take on something you wrote about in the blog post that I really loved. You gave an example about your professor of American literature and how it came back to you 15 years later as a teacher. I'm not going to give it away because I'll let you talk about it, but I think it encapsulates kind of the internal struggle that many teachers have about language, including myself. So again, I'm not going to preface that anyway. Can you tell us that story as we kind of wrap this up? Because I think it's a really nice way to end it.
Yes, of course. It's quite embarrassing actually, but I did share it because I feel that we need to know that as teachers we have the right to change our minds about things throughout our careers. And I was in my last year of finishing up my undergraduate degree, and I was in a class that I really wanted to be in because I heard good things about the professor. And I noticed about probably like a week or two into the semester that 30 to 40% of class time was spent in group discussions. And I was really not a big fan. I thought, oh my gosh, what's going on? So I eventually went up to the professor and I asked him, do I have to stay for those? I really don't want to spend my time talking to the people who know as much as I do. I'm here to listen to you. So please lecture away and let me take notes. And that was back then, and again, didn't have anything to do with education at that point. I was just there in that class to study literature. That was for the first time when I heard that term, internalizing knowledge, and he was kind enough not to be upset with me being so I don't know, disrespectful almost. I really would never do anything like that ever again in my life. But
You
he
were
explained to
curious.
me that,
You weren't disrespectful. You were curious.
yeah, but it
Maybe a
was
little
just
innocent.
I know it's not something I remember fondly. It's not my brightest moment. But he did explain to me that in order for me to really internalize the content or talk about the books, and what we did, we just discussed in groups the notes that we took in class, the books that we read. And he said, like, you really have to participate in those discussions because that's a way for you to internalize knowledge, to internalize that content that I share. And back then, I really disagreed with him. I was not on board. Now, I'm completely opposite. I'm a proponent of student talk. And we know that teacher talk dominates most of our secondary classrooms. And that's the way I liked it 15 years ago. But I had a huge change of heart and a huge change of mind. And that's why I shared this story, because it does take time to figure things out and to learn and it's okay. So it's one profession, I think, where you can go into the next year and do things slightly differently in your classroom. And you can see that how it works with your students, because it's definitely, we see the results pretty much very quickly of what we do.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that story, and you had already shared it, so I didn't feel like you would be too worried about embarrassing yourself on it. And I just think it's great. And I think, you know, you said that that's what you wanted as a student, and that's still what many students want. And quite frankly, it's what many of our own students would prefer to have. So we need to be able to explain to them, like your professor did to you, what it is that we're trying to do, obviously in a way that is age and grade appropriate. But it's not uncommon. And I mean, even I still do some work at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and we have graduate students in education who I will look at the feedback from the courses that I'm on teams on, and they will say, I wish that the professor would speak more because this is the expert and I want to learn what they're doing. But a big part of it is internalizing and discussing. And it's not about language. It's about understanding the concepts and running ideas past one another. So it's not uncommon. I think there are many of us who probably would admit that in certain situations, they would rather not be working in a group. They would rather kind of sit there and passively absorb. But at the end of the day, you're going to take a lot more from it if you're taking that time to process. That's a great story. I appreciate you sharing it. I think a lot of us, it just rang so true for me, and I'm sure many others as well. Okay, so two more questions. The first is one that I ask everyone, and anyone who listens to the podcast knows that I'm going to ask, and that's if there's a book or a film or any other resource that's had an important influence on you, either personally or professionally, that you'd like to recommend to anyone who's listening.
Okay, so the personal reading, something I read for fun. You might, everybody think if we teach the AP English, you might have heard about The Kite Runner. I just read 2 more books by Khaled Hosseini. He's right now, I think he's my favorite writer, my favorite author. I read And the Mountain Echoed, and I read A Thousand Splendid Suns. And most of his books, most of the plots are set in the 80s or the 90s in Afghanistan. And I think that book was really, it was good for me to read those. It's not going to make you an expert on Afghanistan by any means, but it gives you a different lens to see the culture, to see the current events. So I love the books, and it's such a beautiful language. And interestingly, he is a doctor. He's not even a writer. Well, now he is, but his first education for his first profession was medicine. And professionally, I would recommend the book by Dr. Gianfranco Conti and Sam Smith. I mentioned his name today earlier. I think I quoted him. But the book is called Breaking the Sound Barrier. And it was written for foreign language teachers. But to me, as an ESL teacher, as a teacher, language teacher in general, I think it's a great way to, it's just this is the book where I learned the most from, I think, during the last year. And it's all about highly patterned, comprehensible input. It's about listening. Interestingly, we talk about speaking and student talk today, but the book that I recommend is about listening. Can I also recommend a podcast?
Yes, please go ahead. I love that.
So I just listened. I was on a plane to El Paso, and it took me here, there, and back to finish that podcast. But Ton Wen just did the podcast with John Seidlitz, and his podcast is called Teaching Multilinguals. It's on my phone, so I just turn it on and listen to it when I fly. But it was very helpful. If you're familiar with the 7 steps framework, it's a lesson framework for building language-rich academic classrooms, so interactive classrooms. And even if you're familiar with 7 steps, but listening to that podcast just gives you so much more insight into where 7 steps came from and how the book came along. It was beautifully done. I enjoyed it so much, and I recommend it to everyone. So, and it's Ton Wen, and he was talking to John Seidlitz, the founding father of our company.
Yeah, two of my favorite people, by the way. Ton was one of the first people to come on this podcast, and then John's been on a few times, and them together. Actually, they were both at our Impact conference about a month ago, and they did different sessions, but they were highlights. So amazing. Yeah, we'll link to that for sure. Ton's great, and as I mentioned, John is too. And I love the reference of the book, your professional book, because anything that we can do to kind of bring the world of foreign language teaching and multilingual learning, multilingual teaching education together, I think is good. I talked with another one of your colleagues, Anna Mattis, about that maybe 2 years ago, about how, bringing the lote with the multilingual education together, which I think is lacking. So that's great. And we'll link to all of those resources. And finally, Natalia, how can people learn more about the work that you're doing if they want to find out?
Well, the website for our company is seidlitzeducation.com. And of course, we'll link to that. I have a personal blog, and it's Natalia ESL edublogs.org. I'll spell it out. Natalia is NATALIA ESL.edublogs.org. So that is a professional blog. I write about it says secondary English learners, or secondary everything for secondary English learners. But however, some of the blogs I seem like it's a really good topic, and I'm excited to write about it. So I would add it to it. I have a link tree. That's something new I learned how to do. and it's linktr.ee/Natalia Heckman. So that takes you to all my social media that I have.
Perfect. And we'll link to all of those on our show notes, as well as the accompanying blog post here. You'll be able to find a transcript of this episode as well there. So everything that you need and more. And with that, Natalia Heckman, it has been a pleasure to chat with you. This has been a long time coming. I'm glad we finally had a chance to do it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.